An empire so vast that the sun never sets on its domains. From the misty highlands of Britain to the scorching deserts of Egypt, from the Rhine's cold waters to the Nile's fertile banks. But here's the mind-blowing question that kept me awake last night. How on earth did Rome manage to control territories so distant and diverse? How did they keep millions of people in line across 3 continents without phones, without internet, without even proper maps? The answer, my friends, lies in an administrative machine so brilliantly efficient that it shaped the ancient world and still influences governments today. We're talking about a system so sophisticated that modern bureaucrats would be jealous. This wasn't just conquest, this was genius-level organization. But let me ask you something that will make you think twice about power and leadership. Imagine you're standing in the sandals of a Roman governor, appointed to rule over a distant province. You're thousands of miles from Rome, surrounded by people who speak different languages, worship different gods, and frankly, probably aren't thrilled about being conquered. So what would you do? Would you crack down hard, squeeze every last coin from the locals through ruthless taxation, and rule with an iron fist? Or would you try to win their hearts and minds, seek their loyalty, maybe even adopt some of their customs? Here's the thing. Your choice wouldn't just define your own fate. It could determine whether your province prospered or erupted in rebellion. It could make you a hero in Rome's eyes, or have you recalled in disgrace. Some governors became legend. Others ended up as cautionary tales. Today, we're diving deep into the system that held the Roman Empire together for centuries, the administration of the provinces. We'll uncover how Rome transformed raw conquests into organized, profitable territories. From the intricate web of tribute collection to the political intrigue that decided who rose to power and who fell from grace. We'll meet governors who became legends, discover the brutal efficiency of Roman tax collectors, and reveal how a single administrative decision could spark revolts that shook the empire to its core. This is the story of how Rome didn't just conquer the world, they organized it. And trust me, some of these tales are more dramatic than any Hollywood blockbuster. Don't miss this incredible journey through history. Hit that like button if you're ready to discover how the Romans really ruled their empire. Make sure to subscribe to Imperium Chronicles for more epic stories from the ancient world that will blow your mind. And definitely hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest historical adventures. Because once you see how the Romans built their administrative empire, you'll never look at government the same way again. Now here's where things get really fascinating. Rome didn't just throw governors at their provinces randomly and hope for the best. Oh no, they were way smarter than that. They created a brilliant 2-tier system that would make modern political scientists weep with envy. Picture this. You've got this massive empire stretching from Scotland to Sudan, and you need to figure out how to manage it all. So what did the Romans do? They basically said, okay, let's divide and conquer ourselves. They split their provinces into 2 distinct categories, each with its own power structure, its own rules, and its own level of imperial oversight. First, you had the senatorial provinces. These were the old-school territories, the ones that had been conquered way back in the day and were now considered, well, relatively tame. Places like Sicily, that beautiful island that had been Roman for centuries. These provinces were handed over to former consuls, guys who had already proven themselves in Rome's highest offices. Think of them as the retirement posts for distinguished senators. They got to govern with fewer troops, deal with less drama, and basically enjoy a cushy posting where the biggest worry was making sure the grain shipments arrived on time. But then you had the imperial provinces, and these were a completely different beast. These were the frontiers, the danger zones, the places where Rome's enemies were still prowling just beyond the borders. The emperor himself kept direct control over these territories because, frankly, he couldn't afford to mess around. We're talking about places like the Rhine frontier, where Germanic tribes were constantly testing Roman defenses, or the eastern borders where the Parthians were always plotting something. And then there was Egypt. Oh, Egypt! This place was in a league of its own. It wasn't just strategically important. It was the empire's breadbasket. the source of grain that fed the masses in Rome. But here's the absolutely incredible part that shows you just how paranoid and brilliant Augustus was at the same time. Are you ready for this? Augustus, the first emperor, was so worried about Egypt's strategic importance that he literally banned senators from entering the province without his personal permission. Can you imagine that? Here you are, a distinguished Roman senator. Maybe you want to take a little vacation to see the pyramids, check out Alexandria's famous library, and Augustus basically says, "Nope, not without my say-so." Why would he do something so extreme? Because Augustus understood something that would make any modern leader nervous. Egypt was so wealthy, so strategically vital, that whoever controlled it could potentially challenge the emperor himself. He was terrified that some ambitious senator might go down there, cozy up to the locals, take control of the grain supply, and then march on Rome saying, "Hey, remember me? I'm your new emperor now, and I control whether your people eat or starve." This wasn't just paranoia. This was political genius. Augustus had learned from Julius Caesar's example. Caesar had used his conquests in Gaul to build the wealth and loyalty he needed to cross the Rubicon. Augustus wasn't about to let anyone pull the same trick with Egypt. So there you have it. Rome's masterstroke of administrative division. Safe, stable provinces for the senators to play governor in, and the dangerous, vital frontiers kept under imperial control. It was like having a two-speed government, perfectly calibrated to match the threats and opportunities of each territory. Brilliant, right? But here's where the story gets really juicy. Because once you understand the system, you start to wonder, who were these guys actually running the provinces? Were they noble public servants dedicating their lives to Rome's glory? Or were they opportunistic politicians looking to line their own pockets? Well, buckle up, because the truth is way more complicated and fascinating than you might think. Let me tell you about two governors who couldn't be more different if they tried. First up, we have Marcus Tullius Cicero. Yes, that's Cicero. The guy whose speeches we still study today, the master of rhetoric who could talk his way out of almost anything. In 51 before Christ, he got appointed governor of Cilicia, which is in modern-day Turkey. Now, Cilicia wasn't exactly the most prestigious posting. It was kind of the administrative equivalent of being sent to manage a regional office instead of running headquarters. But here's what's absolutely incredible about Cicero. The guy treated his governorship like a masterclass in diplomatic problem-solving. Instead of showing up with a big stick and demanding tribute, he used what he did best. He talked to people. When tensions started brewing and it looked like revolts might break out, Cicero didn't call in the legions. He called in his rhetoric. He held public assemblies, listened to local grievances, and somehow managed to smooth things over with words instead of swords. And get this? Cicero actually wrote letters back to Rome complaining that he wasn't making enough money from his position. While other governors were getting rich, our boy Cicero was being so honest and fair that he was practically broke. His friends back in Rome thought he was crazy. But you know what? His province stayed peaceful, his people were relatively happy, and he went down in history as one of the good guys. Now let's talk about someone who took a very different approach. Pontius Pilate. You probably know his name from a very famous trial involving a certain carpenter from Nazareth. But there's so much more to this story than what you learned in Sunday school. Pilate was appointed governor of Judea around 26 after Christ, and from day one, he was walking into a political minefield. Judea wasn't just any province. It was a powder keg of religious tensions, cultural conflicts, and nationalist sentiments. The Jewish people had very specific religious laws, very strong feelings about Roman occupation, and absolutely zero tolerance for governors who didn't understand their customs. And Pilate? Well, let's just say cultural sensitivity wasn't exactly his strong suit. He made mistake after mistake. He brought Roman standards with images of the emperor into Jerusalem, which was like waving a red flag at a bull because Jewish law forbade graven images. He used temple funds to build an aqueduct, which sounds practical, but absolutely infuriated the religious authorities. Every decision he made seemed to generate more hatred and more unrest. The guy was caught in an impossible situation. Rome expected him to maintain order and collect taxes. The Jewish people expected him to respect their traditions and leave them alone. And when push came to shove, as we all know from history, Pilate chose political survival over justice. He couldn't find a way to balance Roman authority with local sensibilities, and the result was a legacy of tension and conflict that would eventually explode into full-scale revolt. But here's the dirty secret that Rome didn't like to advertise. Corruption was absolutely rampant among provincial governors. And I'm not talking about a little skimming here and there. I'm talking about full-scale looting operations that would make modern kleptocrats blush. See, here's how the system worked in practice. You'd spend years climbing the political ladder in Rome, spending your own money on campaigns, bribing voters, throwing expensive games for the masses. By the time you finally got appointed governor, you were often broke. But hey, no problem. Your governorship was basically seen as your chance to get rich quick. You'd head out to your province, squeeze the locals for everything they were worth, and come back to Rome wealthy enough to buy your way into even higher office. Some governors were so blatant about it that they'd literally arrive in their provinces with empty wagons and leave with them full of gold. They'd invent new taxes, demand tribute that didn't exist in Roman law, and basically treat their territories like personal piggy banks. The locals would complain to Rome, but by the time any investigation happened, the governor would be back in the capital, bribing senators and running for consul. It was a vicious cycle that Rome struggled with for centuries. The good governors, like Cicero, were the exception. The corrupt ones, sadly, were often the rule. And the provinces paid the price in resentment, rebellion, and eventual collapse. So were Roman governors heroes or villains? The answer is, it depends on who you ask, and more importantly, which governor you're talking about. Some were genuinely trying to serve the empire and their people. Others were just there to get rich. And most, like Pilate, were probably somewhere in between. Flawed human beings trying to navigate an impossible system where the wrong choice could cost them everything. But if you think corrupt governors were bad, wait until you hear about the publicans. These guys make the governors look like saints by comparison. And I'm not exaggerating. When Jesus threw the money changers out of the temple, he was actually expressing a sentiment that pretty much every person in the Roman Empire could relate to. So who were these publicans? Picture this. Rome has this massive empire to run, and they need taxes from every corner of it. But here's the problem. The Roman government didn't have thousands of bureaucrats sitting in offices with calculators, figuring out who owed what. Instead, they came up with what seemed like a brilliant solution at the time. They would auction off the right to collect taxes to private contractors. These contractors were called publicans, and here's how their system worked. Let's say Rome decided that the province of Syria should pay 1 million denarii in taxes this year. The publicans would bid against each other for the contract, and whoever won would pay Rome that 1 million denarii up front. Then they'd head out to Syria and collect taxes from the locals. And here's the kicker. Whatever they collected above that 1 million, they got to keep as profit. Can you see the problem here? This system basically gave tax collectors a license to squeeze people for everything they were worth. The more they could extract from ordinary families, farmers, and merchants, the richer they became. It was legalized extortion on an industrial scale. These publicans became absolutely despised throughout the empire. They would show up in villages with armed guards, demand payments that were often double or triple what Rome actually required, and if you couldn't pay, well, they'd take your land, your livestock, sometimes even your family members as slaves. They were like loan sharks with government backing. And the worst part? There was almost nothing you could do about it. Sure, you could try to complain to the provincial governor, but remember what we just learned about governor corruption? Many of them were getting kickbacks from the publicans. It was all one big corrupt machine feeding off the blood, sweat, and tears of ordinary people. But here's where this story takes a dramatic turn that changed history forever. In Judea, the situation with tax collectors became so brutal, so utterly unbearable, that it helped spark one of the most devastating revolts in Roman history. Picture this. You're a Jewish farmer in the hills around Jerusalem in the year 66 after Christ. Your people have been dealing with Roman occupation for generations now, but lately things have gotten much worse. The publicans are squeezing harder than ever before. They're not just taking your grain and your money. They're taking your dignity, your ability to provide for your family, your hope for the future. On top of that, these tax collectors are working with a Roman administration that shows zero respect for Jewish religious law. They're demanding payments on the Sabbath, confiscating temple vessels, treating your most sacred traditions like obstacles to profit. Every interaction with these publicans feels like a knife in the heart of everything you believe in. And then one day, you've had enough. Your neighbors have had enough. The whole region has had enough. What started as tax protests begins to snowball into something much bigger. People start refusing to pay. Roman officials start cracking down harder. Violence breaks out. And suddenly, you're not just dealing with corrupt tax collectors anymore. You're in the middle of a full-scale war. That's exactly what happened with the Great Jewish Revolt that lasted from 66 to 73 after Christ. The brutal tax collection practices didn't cause the revolt by themselves, but they were absolutely one of the major factors that pushed an already frustrated population over the edge. When people feel like they're being systematically robbed by their own government, revolution starts to look like the only option left. And here's something that will blow your mind. The Romans were so organized about taxation that they conducted regular censuses in even the most remote villages throughout the empire. These weren't just head counts. They were detailed inventories of every family's wealth, property, and income potential. Roman census takers would show up in tiny mountain villages, count every sheep, measure every field, and calculate exactly how much each family could afford to pay. This level of administrative reach was unprecedented in the ancient world. Rome knew more about their subjects' finances than most people knew about themselves. It was brilliant from an organizational standpoint, but absolutely terrifying if you were on the receiving end. So here's a question for you. If you had to choose, would you rather be a Roman governor or a publican in ancient times? Think about it. Governors had prestige and political power, but they also had to balance a million different pressures and could be recalled to Rome in disgrace. Publicans could get incredibly rich, but they were universally hated and had to live with armed guards. Neither option sounds particularly appealing when you really think about it, does it? If you're enjoying these insights into how Rome really worked behind the scenes, make sure to share this video with anyone who loves history. And drop a comment below. Would you have chosen to be a governor trying to balance politics and diplomacy, or a publican getting rich but making enemies everywhere you went? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this impossible choice. Now here's where Rome shows us their true genius. Because while they were definitely ruthless conquerors and sometimes brutal administrators, they were also master psychologists who understood something that many empires throughout history completely missed. You can't hold on to conquered territory through fear alone. Eventually, you have to make people want to be part of your system. This is where the art of Romanization comes in, and it's honestly one of the most sophisticated cultural transformation campaigns in human history. Rome didn't just conquer places and leave them to simmer in resentment. They had a deliberate, multi-generational strategy to turn barbarians into Romans, rebels into citizens, and enemies into allies. Let me paint you a picture of how this worked. Imagine you're living in some remote Gallic village around 50 years after Julius Caesar's conquest. Your grandfather probably fought against the Romans and told stories about the old days when your tribe was free. But now things are starting to look a little different. First, the Romans show up and start building. And I don't mean just military camps. I mean incredible infrastructure that makes your jaw drop. They construct roads so smooth and well-engineered that you can travel from your village to the next province faster than ever before. These aren't just dirt paths. These are masterpieces of engineering with proper drainage, mile markers, and rest stops. Then they build aqueducts that bring fresh, clean water right into your town. Water that used to require a dangerous trip to the river is now flowing from beautiful stone fountains in your market square. Your children are growing up healthier, your crops are more reliable, and suddenly Roman occupation doesn't feel quite so oppressive. But here's the real masterstroke. They build an amphitheater. And let me tell you, if you've never seen gladiatorial games before, It's like nothing you could have imagined. The spectacle, the drama, the sheer scale of it all. Suddenly, being connected to the Roman world doesn't just mean better roads and cleaner water. It means being part of something exciting, something grand, something that makes your little village feel connected to the greatest empire the world has ever known. And here's what's brilliant about this strategy. The Romans weren't forcing you to abandon your local gods or your traditional customs. Instead, they were saying, hey, keep worshiping whoever you want, but maybe also appreciate Jupiter while you're at it. Keep your local festivals, but also enjoy these amazing Roman holidays we're introducing. It was cultural seduction rather than cultural domination. They made Roman civilization feel like an upgrade to your existing life rather than a replacement for it. But the ultimate prize, the golden ticket that every provincial dreamed of, was Roman citizenship. This wasn't just a piece of paper. This was your entry into the most exclusive club in the ancient world. Roman citizens got legal protections that non-citizens could only dream of. They could appeal court decisions, they couldn't be tortured without trial, and they had access to Roman courts instead of local justice that might be corrupt or biased. For centuries, Rome used citizenship like a carrot dangling in front of ambitious provincials. Serve in the auxiliary troops for 25 years? Citizenship. Contribute significantly to your local community? Citizenship. Prove your loyalty and usefulness to the empire? Citizenship. And then, in 212 after Christ, Emperor Caracalla did something absolutely revolutionary. He issued what we call the Edict of Caracalla, which granted Roman citizenship to virtually every free person in the empire. Can you imagine the psychological impact of that? Overnight, millions of people who had been subjects became citizens. People whose grandfathers had been conquered barbarians were now full members of the Roman political community. Now, cynics might say Caracalla did this just to expand the tax base, and they wouldn't be wrong. But the cultural impact was enormous. It was Rome's way of saying, you're not conquered peoples anymore, you're Romans. And here's the proof that this strategy worked. Hispania, what we now call Spain, became so thoroughly Romanized that it started producing Roman emperors. Think about that for a second. A territory that had been conquered by force eventually became so integrated into the Roman system that its sons were considered qualified to rule the entire empire. Trajan, one of Rome's greatest emperors, was Spanish. He expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent, built incredible monuments that still stand today, and is remembered as one of the 5 good emperors. But his family had originally been part of the conquered peoples of Hispania. That's not just successful conquest, that's successful transformation. Rome didn't just defeat the Spanish tribes, they convinced them that being Roman was better than being anything else. They took people who had every reason to hate the empire and turned them into some of its most devoted servants. The same thing happened throughout the empire. Gaul produced Roman senators, Britain produced Roman generals, and Africa produced Roman philosophers. Within a few generations, the children and grandchildren of conquered peoples were competing to be more Roman than the Romans themselves. It's honestly one of the most successful cultural assimilation programs in history. Rome understood that the strongest chains aren't made of iron. They're made of ambition, opportunity, and the desire to be part of something greater than yourself. But here's the thing about even the most brilliant systems. They're only as good as the people running them. And when those people become corrupt, greedy, or power-hungry, even the mighty Roman administrative machine could come crashing down in spectacular fashion. Let me tell you a story that perfectly captures just how bad things could get when Roman governors went completely off the rails. Meet Gaius Verres, a man whose name became synonymous with corruption so outrageous that it shocked even the Romans, who had pretty high tolerance for political shenanigans. Verres was appointed governor of Sicily in 73 before Christ, and within 3 years, he had basically turned the entire island into his personal treasure hunt. This wasn't your typical skim a little off the top corruption. This was full-scale artistic and economic pillaging that would make modern art thieves weep with envy. Picture this. Verres would show up at wealthy Sicilian homes and literally demand their most precious possessions. Beautiful Greek statues? His now. Priceless paintings? loading them onto ships back to Rome, family heirlooms that had been passed down for generations. Too bad. They're going to decorate Varus's villa. But it gets worse. He didn't just steal art, he perverted the entire justice system to line his own pockets. If you were a wealthy Sicilian accused of a crime, Varus would basically auction off your fate to the highest bidder. Innocent but rich. You might find yourself condemned unless you paid an enormous bribe. Guilty, but generous with your donations to the governor's retirement fund? Congratulations, you're free to go. The guy was so blatant about his corruption that he once told a dinner party, "The first year's plunder pays for my expenses, the second year's goes to my lawyers for when I get prosecuted, and the third year's is pure profit." He was literally planning his own defense fund while actively robbing his province. And you know what finally brought him down? Our old friend Cicero. Remember him from earlier? The honest governor who complained about not getting rich from his position? Well, Cicero took on Varus' case and delivered a series of speeches so devastating, so packed with evidence of corruption, that Varus fled Rome before the trial was even finished. Those speeches, called the Verrine Orations, are still studied today as masterpieces of legal prosecution. But Varus was just one corrupt governor. What happened when the entire system started breaking down? Well, buckle up, because the 3rd century after Christ was like watching the Roman Empire play a deadly game of musical chairs with the imperial throne. This period, known as the crisis of the 3rd century, lasted from about 235 to 284 after Christ, and it was absolutely chaotic. Here's what happened. The empire became so vast, so difficult to control, and so economically strained that provincial governors started thinking, you know what? Why should I send taxes to Rome when I could just declare myself emperor instead? And that's exactly what they did. We're talking about a 50-year period where there were at least 26 different emperors, and most of them ruled for less than 3 years. Some lasted just a few months. They were called barracks emperors because they were usually military commanders who got their troops to declare them emperor, marched on Rome, or fought other claimants, and then got assassinated or defeated by the next guy with the same idea. Can you imagine the administrative nightmare this created? You're a provincial governor trying to figure out who you're supposed to be loyal to, who you should send taxes to, and whose laws you should be enforcing. Meanwhile, emperors are popping up and disappearing faster than you can get messages back and forth to Rome. Some of these rebel governors were actually competent leaders who might have made decent emperors under different circumstances. But the system had become so unstable, so riddled with competing ambitions and economic pressures, that even good men were pulled into the chaos. Take Postumus, for example. He was a capable Roman general who declared independence in Gaul around 260 after Christ and actually managed to run his own Gallic empire for about 10 years. He provided good government, defended against barbarian invasions, and kept his territories prosperous. But from Rome's perspective, he was just another rebel who needed to be crushed. The really tragic part is that many of these provincial revolts happened because the central government was failing its basic responsibilities. Provinces weren't getting military protection from barbarian invasions, the currency was being debased to worthlessness, and taxes were being raised to impossible levels to fund endless civil wars. So local commanders looked around and thought, Rome can't protect us, Rome can't provide stable currency, and Rome just keeps demanding more money for wars that don't benefit us. Why exactly are we staying loyal to this system? It's a perfect example of how administrative breakdown can create a vicious cycle. Corruption and instability at the center lead to rebellion in the provinces, which creates more instability at the center, which leads to harsher crackdowns and higher taxes, which creates more reasons for provinces to rebel. The empire eventually stabilized under Diocletian, but by then, the damage was done. The old system of Roman provincial administration had been shattered, and what emerged was something much more rigid, much more militarized, and ultimately much less sustainable than what had come before. It's a sobering reminder that even the most sophisticated governmental systems can collapse when the people running them lose sight of their responsibilities to the people they're supposed to serve. Rome's provincial administration worked brilliantly for centuries, but when corruption became systemic and central authority became weak, the the whole magnificent structure came tumbling down. So here we are at the end of our journey through the corridors of Roman power, and I have to ask, what have we really learned about the rise and fall of the greatest administrative system the ancient world ever saw? Roman provincial administration was essentially a massive centuries-long experiment in governance, power, and human nature. It was a delicate balancing act between efficiency and brutality, between local autonomy and central control, between rewarding loyalty and extracting wealth. And for hundreds of years, somehow, impossibly, it actually worked. Think about what the Romans accomplished. They took dozens of different peoples, Gauls and Germans, Egyptians and Britons, Greeks and Jews, speaking different languages, worshiping different gods, living completely different ways of life, and they created a system that held them all together under one government. That's not just impressive, it's almost miraculous when you consider the technology and communication limitations they were working with. But here's what strikes me most about this whole story. Roman administration was fundamentally a game of human psychology. It was about understanding what motivates people, what makes them loyal, what pushes them to rebellion. The Romans who succeeded were the ones who figured out how to make conquered peoples want to be part of the empire. The ones who failed were those who thought fear and force were enough. The system worked when it was flexible, when it adapted to local conditions, when it offered real benefits to the people it governed. Roads, aqueducts, citizenship, opportunities for advancement, these weren't just administrative tools, they were promises of a better life. Rome was essentially saying, join us, and your children will have opportunities you never dreamed of. But the system failed catastrophically when corruption and greed took over, when governors started seeing provinces as personal piggy banks rather than responsibilities, when tax collectors became predators rather than administrators, when the central government became so focused on internal power struggles that it forgot its basic obligations to the people it ruled. And here's the uncomfortable truth that keeps me up at night. We can see echoes of these same patterns throughout history, right up to the present day. Every empire, every government, every administrative system faces the same fundamental challenge that Rome faced. How do you maintain legitimacy and effectiveness when human beings are involved? How do you prevent the corruption that power inevitably breeds? Because let's be honest, the problems that brought down Roman provincial administration weren't unique to ancient times. Corrupt officials enriching themselves at public expense? We've seen that. Leaders more focused on personal power than good governance? Unfortunately familiar. Tax systems that crush ordinary people while the wealthy find ways to avoid their obligations? Sounds like something we might read about in today's news. The rise and fall of Roman administration is ultimately a story about what happens when systems designed to serve people become systems designed to serve themselves. Rome's provincial machine was brilliant when it was focused on creating prosperity, stability, and opportunity for its subjects. But when it became primarily focused on extracting wealth and maintaining power, it sowed the seeds of its own destruction. What makes this story particularly haunting is that the Romans weren't stupid or evil. Most of them, anyway. They were intelligent, capable people who built incredible things and solved complex problems. But they got caught in the same trap that catches every powerful institution eventually. They started believing that the system existed for their benefit rather than for the benefit of the people they were supposed to serve. So maybe the real lesson from Roman provincial administration isn't about ancient history at all. Maybe it's about recognizing these patterns when we see them in our own time, in our own institutions, in our own leaders. Because the human nature that drove Roman governors to corruption, that tempted publicans to extortion, that led provinces to rebellion, that same human nature is still with us today. The Romans built something magnificent, and then they destroyed it through their own greed and short-sightedness. The question is, are we smart enough to learn from their mistakes, or are we doomed to repeat them? If this deep dive into the secrets of Roman power has opened your eyes to how empires really work behind the scenes, I'd love to hear from you. Hit that like button to let me know this kind of historical analysis resonates with you. And here's a fun question for the comments. If you could go back in time and govern any Roman province, which one would you choose and why? Would you pick wealthy Egypt with all its political dangers? Frontier Britain with its constant military challenges? Or maybe peaceful Sicily where you could focus on administration without worrying about barbarian invasions? Make sure to subscribe to Imperium Chronicles because we're just getting started on this journey through the corridors of ancient power. Next time, we'll be exploring how Roman military logistics fed an empire. And trust me, that story is every bit as fascinating and relevant as what we've covered today. Until our next epic journey through history, remember, the past isn't just about what happened, it's about understanding the patterns that keep shaping our world today. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you in the next video.